His son Luke and I are lifelong friends. We were both chubby, classic rock-loving teenagers. One day in grade 8, I noticed the teachers started high-fiving Luke. It was the dot-com boom, and his father, Norm, had founded one of Canada's leading software companies. Norm is the recipient of the 2019 Fraser Institute Founders Award. Here is how they introduce him. Norm Francis was a pioneering technology entrepreneur in Canada. He co-founded BSG, which created ACCPAC and Simply Accounting, two of the world's premier accounting software packages in the early personal computer era. Later, he was co-founder, chairman, and CEO of Pivotal Corporation, which became a world leader in customer relationship management software. As president of Boardwalk Ventures Inc., he continues to be an active angel investor and mentor to early-stage technology companies. Norm was a co-founder of Social Venture Partners Vancouver, and he and his family are active philanthropists. In 1999, Norm was named the BC Technology Industry Person of the Year, and he was named 2001 Pacific Region Software Entrepreneur of the Year by Ernst and Young. He was honored as a fellow of the BC Institute of Chartered Accountants in 2005, and in 2016, Norm was inducted into the Business Laureates of BC Hall of Fame. Norm holds a Bachelor of Science in Computer Sciences and is a FCPA. I took advantage of my proximity to Norm growing up and sought his advice many times in my career. He has been a major role model for me. I am honored and grateful to welcome Norm Francis to the first episode of the CEO.CA Mentors Podcast. Thank you, Norm, for coming on.
Happy to be here.
I want to talk about everything, but there's just one question I wanted to start with. Can you please describe the circumstances that led you to have dinner with Bill Gates? What was that all about?
Well, we were a close partner with Microsoft in selling software on what was at that point the new client server platform. And so Bill and Melinda would periodically host dinners at their house for some of their partners, and I was fortunate to be able to go to their house and have dinner with a small group of CEOs. It was pretty interesting.
What was the place like?
Well, at that time, they had built a very modern, in that day, that was 20 years ago now, house. But the most interesting was his library. And in his library, he has 40 pages of the Da Vinci Codex. And so I was able to see that it still sticks in my mind, be 1 foot away from pages with Leonardo da Vinci's diagrams and formulas on it. That was amazing.
That's incredible. Is there anything else about that dinner you remember?
Martha Stewart was there.
Was this pre-incarceration?
It was, yeah. That was in her heydays.
They were hard on her.
Yeah. Phil Knight, the CEO of Nike, was there. John Chambers, who was the CEO of Cisco. So it was an interesting group. Wow. I was kind of the little guy in the group.
So you come a long way from a small town in the Okanagan at that point.
That's true.
Tell me a little bit about your early years. Where did you grow up?
Grew up in Oliver in the South Okanagan when it was all fruit trees, before grapes, before the wine industry. Born there, went all the way through up to high school before I left there.
So what was the population of Oliver at the time?
Probably the whole surrounding area, under 1,000 people.
Where do you think your ambition came from?
I think farmers, I think my sort of love of entrepreneurism came from growing up in a farming community. Because farmers are, when you think about it, at least in those days, they're kind of little independent business people, and they have to rely upon themselves. They have to help their neighbors. And hard work was always, every kid was expected to do chores at a young age, and every kid, once you could go out and pick fruit, you were expected to work, and you could go out and make money, and everybody worked, and I guess maybe that's where it came from. And plus, I would say my dad, who was a high school dropout, my dad worked hard. He did extra things to help our family. He would buy a piece of land and he'd build a little house on it and then sell a house. So my dad was an entrepreneur, and I guess it kind of rubbed off on me.
Would you say he was your early mentor, your father? Or?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
How did you get from being in a farming community the focus into technology in your education?
Well, technology didn't exist in those days, of course. But when we had very good high school, great teachers, and it was kind of expected in my family. My mother and my father encouraged both myself and my younger sister to go off to school, and so I came to the big city, to Vancouver, to go to university. And but all I knew was math and sciences, and that's where I started. And that was like really pre-computers.
So were you in the accounting program first or in computer science?
No, computer science. And really what happened is in the late 60s is when that was.
You're dating yourself.
Yeah, for sure. That was when UBC first put in a computer science program, and I switched. And what had happened, actually, it was kind of fortuitous, because after my first year, I applied to be an engineer. I thought I would be an engineer. And after my first year I applied, and I got rejected. So I couldn't get into engineering school, so I continued in math, and that's when they offered computer science. And I said, boy, that sounds interesting. And that's kind of how it happened.
What was computer science like at that time?
Well, in today's terms, it was relatively primitive. They had one big computer. It was an IBM 360. And for my first year, you actually you keyed in punch cards, and then you'd take your program. It was all very low-level programming, and you'd put it in a card reader and wait overnight, and then the results would come out, and that's kind of...
Was it like learning a new language at the time?
Well, it was, because... But the good thing about UBC in those days was it was very theoretical computer science. So we learned the basics of how computers really operate and how you really program them, and still the way they operate to this day.
Were there many technology companies in BC at that time?
None.
Wow.
None. And in fact, what happened with me was when I graduated with a computer science degree, there were actually no jobs. You couldn't get a job as a programmer, and especially the kind of theoretical computer science that they happened to teach there. And in that day and age, there were a few jobs out programming COBOL, which is a distant, long-lost language, but I hadn't learned that at university, and I literally, there were no job prospects. And so just because I knew some friends who were going into accounting, I knew nothing about business. I decided, well, I'm going to go and become an accountant. And so that kind of led me into becoming a chartered accountant, articling to become a chartered accountant.
So chartered accountant, that was a joint degree that you were doing at the time, or did you?
No, that was after university. It was after university, and it just happened totally by chance.
Did you have to put in the grunt work like accountants do today when they're getting their designation? And so you worked for a few years in audits and that sort of thing? As
an articled student, doing audits, taking courses at night, basically work and school like constantly, because I had no background. And in those days, the accounting firms, they were just starting to realize that computers were going to start to impact business. So they kind of had this idea that they'd hire a few computer science folks and turn them into accountants rather than try to take accountants and teach them about computers. And so it was just, and what happened is actually I went to interview, didn't know anything about, I didn't know a debit from a credit. I went to interview, and the guy doing the interviews, he was from Penticton, which was just immediately north of where I grew up. And he looked at my resume, and he says, "You're from Oliver." We talked about the Oliver and the Okanagan
orchards
through the interview, and lo and behold, they invited me back for a second interview, and kind of it changed that kind of one guy whose name was George Debrizet, kind of changed the trajectory of my career, actually.
Absolutely. Yeah. And what good luck. So did you spend a few years working as an accountant, or?
Yeah, I spent 6 years full-time, and then again, somewhat fortuitously I had left, it was with Pete Marwick, now KPMG, and what happened is myself and another fellow started a small accounting firm doing small business books and tax advice and all that kind of stuff, and met a couple of guys who had started selling little computers called microcomputers in those days. This is in the late 70s. And through that, they had the idea, hey, maybe we could, businesses could do accounting on these things. And that's when we formed BSG and we developed ACCPAC. And it was kind of the marrying of early computers and accounting.
So how long was the BSG experience for you guys? Were you involved for it?
It started in the late 70s, and we sold the company in the mid 80s to an American company called Computer Associates, now known as CA Technologies.
But the concept was just simply accounting software.
Originally, it was accounting software, but we also ended up doing word processing software and a variety of other software because these little computers at that time. Oh, and what happened was in the early 80s, the IBM PC came out, and that changed the whole world of small computers. And IBM professionalized the business, and that's when things really took off. And
You're
a lot
in
of
the
other
perfect place at the perfect time.
Right.
Was there other accounting softwares at the time?
Yeah, there was. One of the principal competitors was software out of North Dakota, of all places, called Great Plains Software, and that company was later acquired by Microsoft, and today that's what people would know as Microsoft Dynamics, and that came out of North Dakota. And the guy, Doug Burgum, who was the CEO, who became a friend of mine along the way as a friendly competitor, and he's now the governor of North Dakota.
Wow. So how did you finance BSG? Was that through the accounting business on the side, or did you raise venture capital?
We had other business interests on the side. We were doing some real estate deals and doing all kinds of stuff. And then we need to raise a little money, and we did a little tax shelter limited partnership. My uncle invested and a few other people we knew, and it was $25,000 units, $175,000 in total.
Wow.
Is how that started.
How did the commercialization go? I mean, you started with building a product, and was it for yourselves initially?
Well, but at that point, actually, we had a couple of arrangements down in California where we licensed it to some of the early microcomputer companies. A company called North Star we had a relationship with. Those companies are long gone now. They eventually went out of business, as the industry changed. And we actually also had a word processor called EasyWriter, which we licensed to a company down in Sausalito, and became quite successful for us. But later we just focused on accounting.
What were some of the biggest lessons learned during that first software company building experience?
Well, I think, again, somewhat fortuitously, we spent a lot of time in the Bay Area. Even though we were from Vancouver. In Vancouver in those days, if you went around and used the word software, in those days, people, you just kind of have a glazed sort of, like, what's software? But because of this relationship with these little computer companies down in the Bay Area, in those days, they actually weren't in what is now known as Silicon Valley. They were actually in the East Bay over by Berkeley, because a lot of the original people came out of those schools. And so I think we kind of had the early experiences in that U.S., what became Silicon Valley market. And so that was really, I guess, learning that American style business, I'd call it, as that very rapidly growing computer business started to develop in the in the early 80s.
What is the American style? Just aggressive, or
more aggressive, more think big? Americans always think about hitting not just a home run, but like a home run out of the ballpark, and just a faster paced, more competitive, more aggressive style of business.
So that experience made you more ambitious, potentially?
I think more savvy about what the opportunity was and kind of how to go about it. And then when we sold the company in in '85, I became vice president of this company, Computer Associates, which was based on Long Island, and it was run by a guy who became quite famous, Charles Wong, and he was a hard-driving New York-style businessman. And I spent 3 years with Computer Associates in a time when it went from what would now be considered small, but in those days it was, I think, around 140 million in revenue. It was publicly listed at that point on New York. And in 3 years, the company went from 140 million to over $1 billion in revenue. Wow. Acquisitions with a very, I'll call it that New York more sales-y style of business.
What was the purpose in the sale to them? Was it just to monetize and make some money for yourselves, or
partially? And I think we were a bit, I don't know, maybe worried is the right term, that the industry was growing and competition was coming in, and as being based in Vancouver, it was hard to finance something, and to some degree we didn't know how, and so it was kind of, we'll take the money, which is a bit of a West Coast phenomenon.
And after the 3 years was it Computer Associates? Did you take some time off after that, or immediately jump into?
Yeah, I sort of retired for a while, and
at what age?
Went traveling, and with at that time a young family, and so yeah, took some time off to kind of reflect.
Would you have been mid-30s at that point?
I think I was around 40 or late 30s, 40ish.
And you didn't actually think you were done at that point, did you?
I didn't know what I was going to do.
Interesting. So how did you end up deciding what it is you did?
Well, what happened was, again, a bit of a coincidence. Is we had a call from. We had a call, myself and a fellow named Keith Wales, who had been at BSG. He was retired. And we had a call from a guy we knew down in California, and he joined a new company, and they were doing this interesting thing, which at that time was called pen computing. And the concept was to have a tablet, and you would write on the screen, and it would interpret your handwriting, and it would do things. Today we know of it as the iPad, but this was the precursor of the iPad, and it was a new company. It was called Go Corporation, and it was one of the hot new startups trying to pioneer this hardware and software technology. And so the idea attracted us, and so one thing led to another, and Keith and I thought, well, we'll jump back into this. We started a little company. One of the engineers that had been at BSG joined us, and we formed a company called Pen Magic, and set off to develop applications that would work on this kind of new style of tablet.
What was the year of the incorporation of Pen Magic?
That was in like 91.
Interesting.
Early 90s, just before pre-internet.
Was Wales your partner at BSG as well?
Yes.
So you had started the company together?
Right.
What was the dynamic of your partnership? Like, how did you divide responsibilities between you?
Well, Keith was a deep technical guy. He had come out of UBC also. And so Keith kind of ran engineering, and I ran the business side. And because I had a computer science degree, I knew enough to be dangerous and sort of relate to engineers. And we did what often happens with a new company. We pulled in some of the guys that had worked with us before, top-notch engineers, and we just kind of did it all again.
How did you capitalize Pen Magic?
Keith and I, by that time, we had the money to capitalize it ourselves.
Personally put some money in. And were there tablets at the time, or were you just hopeful that
they existed? And they were prototype.
But your theory was that they were going to get a lot bigger, and that you'd be there in front of it at the time?
Yeah. So and there was a lot of it was kind of an interesting, it was easy to publicize too, because it kind of it was very innovative, and we would do these photo shoots sitting in boats with a tablet and writing on them. And, at that point, the technology was rapidly developing, but sort of still relatively primitive.
But you could sense the market wanted it, and certainly the press liked it.
It was an
too.
interesting idea that you could have a tablet and you could write on it, and it would do all kinds of things that you wanted to do, and then it would have a modem built into it, and it could transmit, and you could do email. It was an interesting idea that was ahead of its time, actually, as it turned out.
Which applications were you focused on?
Oh, we did a spreadsheet, which you could kind of think of it like you're writing on a spreadsheet, but it would do the kinds of things that you think of that a spreadsheet can do. And you could fold the paper on the screen, and we'd do in database and things that conceptually you could do on a personal computer, because personal computers were quite popular in those days, but you would be able to do it on a portable tablet.
What was the hardware at that time? Like which tablets were in the market?
Well, the whole idea was pioneered by a company called Go, which was a pure startup. and was heavily venture capital funded. They were in Silicon Valley, and they were doing the hardware and the software. But then other companies, there was a company called Grid. These companies are all long gone now.
Where did the Palm Pilot come into picture?
Around the same time, a little later actually, because what happened is the tablets, for a combination of the technology, just didn't come together. The screens weren't good enough, the battery life wasn't good enough, not enough processing power in the tablets, and that industry, it just kind of went flat. And at that point, the Palm Pilot, a guy named Jeff Hawkins had been in one of the early tablet companies, and he had the idea that, hey man, let's just make this simpler and we'll make a more simple device. And he developed that little sort of shorthand language that, and the Palm Pilot really restarted the handheld market.
Was your company Pen Magic, was it slower to get traction than BSG was? Or did you?
Oh, yeah, because we never really could, because the industry never gelled. And, we would sell little bits of stuff, but essentially it was still at kind of beta testing, early stage. So after several years of doing this, everybody was running out of dough. There'd been hundreds of millions of dollars poured into hardware companies. And we really just had to say, hey, this isn't going to happen. And so we sat there and said, well, should we wrap this up or should we do something else? It was literally like that.
Was that pretty scary to walk away from the time and money that had gone into it? Yeah,
it was disappointing. And we had lots of colleagues that were, it was like a community all trying to create this new technology. And actually there were some good lessons from it, because the people who were behind Go, they all, some of them went on to found Netscape. And many of the other famous companies, and I think it's actually Go Corp is a good lesson, and failure is not bad. It happens when you're pushing the envelope, trying to create something new. And many of those people went on to become key figures in the creation of the internet, key people at Google. And in fact, one of the fellows who became very well known after that, the CEO of Go, was a guy named Bill Campbell, and Bill Campbell. He has since passed the coach, and in fact, he became the coach of coaching the young CEOs of Google, and Bill's famous.
And Steve Jobs and.
So in fact, there's a very excellent book. Bill was a fabulous guy. I knew him quite well, and he was a fabulous guy, and became, in fact, a mentor to many of the really big, famous tech companies now.
Wow. What was it about him that made him a great coach? Or
well, interestingly, the reason they called him a coach, he'd actually been a football coach, and he came from a sales background. He had been senior VP of sales at Apple in the early days, and he just had one of those infectious, positive personalities. Just a guy who everybody liked. He was just a really neat person.
Was Pen Magic venture funded?
Towards about the middle of its life, we had venture capital from a venture firm called Kleiner Perkins in Silicon Valley. They were in the 90s one of the really famous.
Were they then the great success they became with?
They were.
Google
they had been the original VC behind Sun Microsystems, and they'd been involved in Intel and many of the early more hardware.
Who was the partner on Kleiner's side that was your liaison, or who did you guys deal with there?
Well, I sort of remember the first time they really got interested when they saw our software. It was sitting in a hotel room, actually, and I demoed our early pen software to John Doerr, who's still the head. He's very famous. And
he was instrumental with Google, I think, too.
Yeah, he found Amazon. He was the first investor in Amazon. He was the first investor in Intuit. He was on the board. He was the first board member from Kleiner Perkins and Google. So pretty well-known guy. And
you met him before that, yeah. Yeah,
and he was. John was one of these kind of venture capitalists. When he saw something, man, he was totally enthusiastic. We were the first investment they did outside the U.S. Actually. These little guys in North Vancouver. And but I actually negotiated the deal with another fellow who became quite well known. Vinod Khosla was his name, and he he later split off and has started his own Khosla Ventures. He and a fellow named Doug McKenzie, who was kind of his understudy, who eventually became on our board.
That was really their heyday as a venture firm. What was their culture? What was so special about them then?
Well, they had a group of 10 or a dozen really bright partners, and they went looking for new trends. They actually bombed out, of course, on the whole pen computing. They spent a lot of money on it, and it didn't work out. But fortunately, there were a few other things came along, like this young guy named Mark Andreessen, who walked in the door with this thing called a web browser out of university, and they thought, oh boy, we could maybe make a company out of that. That became Netscape, and that sort of pioneered the whole browser thing. I think they saw early trends, and they would bet on multiple companies and they saw the internet coming, and they saw the opportunity for e-commerce, I think, in particular, on the internet in the 90s.
What did you learn about raising money through those processes?
Well, I learned that you have to be a good pitch person, and you have to have, to deal with those people, you have to have super good technology, because they really want to know that you've got defendable technology. And so a great engineering team, a big market, potentially big market, because they don't do anything, they're not looking for singles or doubles. They're, looking for, as I said earlier, to not only hit home runs, but big home runs, Google and Amazon style home runs.
Was it a big relief when they agreed to sign on and support you guys?
Well, they did. But that was, keep in mind, that was in the pen days. And then that all kind of, as I referred to earlier, that kind of went flat. And we were sitting in a room, Keith, myself, and Doug McKenzie on the board, just the board of three, and said, this isn't going to work. What are we going to do? Do we just take the money that's in the bank account and shut her down? Or what do we do? So we kind of brainstormed, and we had an idea. We did a complete 180 and decided we would do enterprise software. And we kind of had some ideas about this area, which at that time was called sales automation. And we thought, well, we could broaden this and do client server, because Microsoft was doing this new thing called Microsoft NT and SQL Server. And so we made the decision to, we went back to the drawing board, spent a year developing a prototype. And to their credit, Kleiner Perkins stuck with us the whole time. Keith and I decided we wouldn't just wrap up the company and do that in a new company. We did what we thought was the honorable thing, and we restarted it. We ended up doing a down round. Once we had the prototype, we did a down round with with an additional venture capital firm. And I think Kleiner Perkins appreciated that we didn't just sort of dump them and start the new business in a new company kind of thing.
Was that about mid-90s, 95, something like that?
Yeah, it was 94 actually, I think.
So yeah. The concept for the new product, was that coming from customers, or did you guys have a vision, or?
It's just, I guess, our knowledge of business and some colleagues who kind of were in the sales automation area, and we thought, gee, we can do this in a much better way. I guess similarly to when we did accounting software, we thought, wow, we can do this in a different way, and we can disrupt this market. We can come out with something which is fresh and novel and sort of innovative, and so that's kind of how it happened.
How quickly did you get traction?
It took us a couple of years to develop the product and get those early beta customers and do a lot of evangelizing about how this could help their business. And then it started to take off, and we went from basically no revenue to 100 million plus US revenue and 20 plus offices around the world. We did that in 5 years flat, just
wow.
about. And public on the NASDAQ at that point.
What was the impetus to go public?
Well, once you have professional investors, venture capital in the firm, and you've attracted a lot of employees, and you keep them with options, you have to have a liquidity event. And in those days, it was the heydays of the .com era. And
what was it like being a public company CEO?
Tough, really, really tough. A lot of people think it's, well, at least in those days, a lot of it was going on, and it was sort of get rich quick kind of thing. And it's a very intense kind of life, that quarterly grind of making the numbers and always, being on analyst calls and being on the road. It's an very intense life, especially in the tech business where it's very quickly changing, and you're kind of only as good as your last quarter's results.
So I just said that .com boom, I always wish that I was just born a little bit earlier so I could have participated in it. What was it? Were you so focused on Pivotal that you didn't really pay too much attention to what else was going on? I'm just wondering, what did it feel like watching this tidal wave of capital and questionable ventures get funded? Like, what were you thinking?
Oh no, we were because it was all around you. You couldn't avoid it, and there were companies popping up and new technologies, and there were acquisitions going on, there were mergers. So you always had to be sort of seeing what was the next thing, because keep in mind that at that point, everyone was really, there were just so many new things coming up. Search had come up with the early companies. Yahoo, was very successful. How do you do e-commerce? I can remember sitting around in the mid-90s when we were changing the business plan. And I can remember sitting around the table and we were kind of thinking about, could this new thing, the internet, could you do a store on this? And in fact, before we did CRM, we kind of rejected that idea. Shows you how dumb we were. Yeah. Oh no, that wouldn't really work. And of course, the rest is history. And I remember being at a Kleiner Perkins insider event, and Jeff Bezos was there, and that's when this little thing called Amazon selling a few books when they had started it. And people were still, in 1995, people were still unsure as to whether that would really work, that business model.
Incredible. But by the late 90s, I'm sure there were thousands of listed companies and questionable business plans getting funded. Yeah. Did you pay much attention to that? Everyone around you starting tech deals, and
I was given the opportunity to invest in some of them, and actually today, with some of the things going on with the valuations of the so-called unicorns and some of the recent revelations about WeWork and some of these others, there's a bit of deja vu, put it that way, of questionable valuations and questionable business models. There's a bit of deja vu.
But in the early days, I guess it was a tight community of really competent people. And
there were a lot of people coming into it because because the technology, keep in mind, these markets tend to happen when there's a convergence of the right technologies become available. And we had the internet, we had high powered computing, we had wireless communication had come about, so it was possible to do handheld devices like the BlackBerry in the early days. And so once that conversion happened, it'll tend to attract investment, and so there was money pouring into it, and so it was the Wild West all over again, a little bit like in the mid 80s, in the early days of the PCs.
What would you say were the best days of the Pivotal experience?
Oh, I think the best days are when a market is just you have the ability to create a market and define a market, and it is just the customers are there, and once you're past the early adopters and you get into that sort of mid adopter stage, and people are telling themselves they have to have it, then you're really just, your biggest problem is, can you hire enough people sort of quickly enough? That's a lot of fun. It's very entrepreneurial. It's very fast moving. You feel you're creating something new that's helping people, in our case, helping businesses. And so it's pretty fun.
How did you keep your head on straight?
How did I keep my head on straight?
I mean, you created one of the great Canadian software companies, and the valuations are soaring. I mean, I imagine that would have been heady times.
It was, and we're getting all kinds of company awards, fastest growing this, fastest growing to that, and yeah, it can kind of get to you, and in a bad way. I guess having grown up in a small farming town, I like to think of myself as being a pretty normal person. I didn't change my friends. I still hung around with the same people. I didn't, I had family, still doing like normal stuff. And I guess that kind of kept me grounded to a certain degree.
What was the success? What did it feel like? And was there anything that you did, anything fun that you did at first to celebrate, or?
Oh, I think you always go out and buy yourself, kind of reward yourself with your first, watch that costs $5,000, or your sort of first
I'm thinking
decent car.
You used to drive.
Your first decent car, kind of thing. So yeah, you do reward yourself a little bit, I think.
Were there any big regrets of the experience in Pivotal?
I would say one of my regrets is we probably grew too quickly. I think we got wound up a bit too much in the go, and that's just because it's all around you. The grow at all costs, and I think probably there were a few instances where I felt, I take responsibility as CEO. Maybe you drop the bar a little bit on things like hiring, and you maybe drop the bar on not sort of reinforcing culture as consistently, and it's really difficult when you got offices all over the place and you're hiring people, and we did a number of acquisitions to kind of hold all that together and have it sort of consistent.
What do you think were the toughest days?
Well, the toughest days were right after 9/11, because the market had started to flatten through early 2001, throughout the whole software space. The whole industry and the whole .com was just booming at that time, but you could sort of sense the winds were blowing in a different direction. And then when the planes flew into the tower on 9/11, the towers, everything went on hold because no one knew where the world was going to go. And so all the buying, everything, all capital acquisitions in our potential customers, it all went on hold. And we had to downsize, and that was tough.
Could you see
by
that?
By that time, actually, I had retired as CEO. I was still chairman of the board, but I had retired I had no operating sort of capacity, but I was still the chair of the board, and obviously I'd been a co-founder, so I felt a lot of responsibility, and so our numbers flattened. We had to downsize, and that was tough, real tough.
Could you feel that immediately when you watched cable and saw this horrific scene on TV? Did you knew that would happen in the market?
Well, I don't think the next day, but within, as the feedback started to come from the sales force, within a week, all appointments were being canceled. Everything was on hold, and interestingly, we were on a calendar year end, and so September 30th was a year end, and a quarter end, and that was the start of some sort of challenging times.
What was the ultimate outcome for Pivotal? It was acquired later.
It was acquired later. Yeah. At that point, I was still chair of the board, and it was acquired, merged into another company, merged with other companies, as often happens. And we had a number of, prior to that, we had a number of merger and acquisition opportunities, which we had not gone forward with. So it was kind of, there was a lot of deal making going on, mergers of different companies.
And in the 15 odd years since, what have you been up to?
Well, I call myself a retired guy, although my wife would sort of question that. I took quite a bit of time out just to enjoy life and travel and find the sun and go and ride bike and ski and do things like that. Yeah, attempt at golf. And then I got back into doing more. I was on a few boards, but then I got all away from doing all that. And I turned actually right in 2001, I turned myself to more community giving back, and helped found an organization called Social Venture Partners Vancouver, which uses a engaged philanthropy model, sometimes called venture philanthropy. And I got a lot of satisfaction out of that, where we all kind of put in money and time and donate it we try to find early stage nonprofits and we'll take a risk on them and help them with their mission, whatever it might be. And so I spent a lot of time with that.
Which would you say were the most satisfying projects that you worked on with BC Social Venture Partners?
Well, I'm very proud of recognizing and being involved with an organization called Take a Hike, which has flourished in Vancouver and throughout BC, and they help get kids who are out of school and on the street and doing drugs and get them back into school. Often these kids have had, teenagers have had no chance in life, maybe from foster homes, etc., and they get them back into school with a very high-touch program, get them through school and kind of try to change the course of their life. And that's been a great project. It's a great organization. One called Kids Safe that helps kids in the East Side, with the after-school program. Another one I'm very proud of, one-to-one literacy, that uses a volunteer model to help disadvantaged kids who are falling behind in reading in schools, and is now throughout BC. And it mobilizes volunteers, such as retired people, to go in and read to little kids to help them keep up with their reading. I'm real proud of that one. YOBRO, which is a program down in Surrey, tries to keep, started with trying to keep young men, teenagers out of gangs and going down the wrong path in life, and now actually has a program for teenage girls too, trying to keep them out of the sex trade and all that kind of stuff, and run by a great guy, Joe Calandino, whose story is well known as an ex-Hells Angel. And
you're just coming from lunch with Joe, aren't you?
Yeah, and he's a great guy, and I'm proud to know him as a guy who came back from being a bad guy and now is out there helping thousands of kids. So it's been enjoyable for me kind of doing that.
Giving back a bit.
Yeah.
I know you probably don't like the label angel investor and don't appreciate too much solicitation, but I'm wondering, how do you decide to get involved with ventures today? Because you do from time to time.
Yeah. Well, usually they're introduced to me by colleagues. There are many around both our Vancouver and Silicon Valley and throughout North America. There are these loose networks of people who have typically been successful investors, or they come from the tech business, they're retired from the tech business often, and I'll get a phone call and somebody will say, hey, I met this great entrepreneur, I'm going to invest in this deal. They've done a lot of due diligence, and kind of then these loose networks kind of will put together a tranche of money and back a young entrepreneur, typically young entrepreneur, with a new idea. And most of these angels have made and lost money, and they know how to take risks. And I usually go by intuition, both about the product or whatever they're doing, and usually about the person.
You always get to know the founders?
Oh, yeah, always. Yeah.
What expectations do you have of the founders that you invest in?
Just honesty, integrity, be straight up with the business plan or whatever their idea is. It'll never go according to the way you think you're going to go. Be straight up with your investors. There will be potholes in the road. And just look for somebody who's really trying to do something truly different. There's a lot of Me Too ideas out there. Personally, I look for things that are true disruptors. They're creating a new market with some new kind of product or service that is truly doesn't exist. And usually I look for something that personally that has some kind of real deep technology strength. It's something truly innovative and new.
What do you think are common mistakes that founders make?
They try to compete against things that sort of already exist, and they think they can, with a few extra features, that they can go in and compete against something that already exists. Pretty common mistake, that they think they're innovative, but they're not really. I think founders often don't gather enough expertise around them. And I always tell young entrepreneurs in particular to go out and be a bit gutsy about making phone calls, cold calling people and say, hey, could I have coffee with you and solicit your advice, people that maybe they read about that can help them, and get a group of advisors who can kind of challenge your ideas.
Do you think that ordinary investors should participate in venture capital? And if so, how?
Well, I think that I don't know what you mean by ordinary investor, but
just like a regular mom and pop people or young people.
I don't think so.
Very sexy.
I don't think so. The only way I'd recommend doing it is there are, I guess, a few ways to do it through a fund where professionals are doing the venture or seed investing. If you can, that's the only way I'd recommend doing it, where people who know what they're doing, you can get exposure to it. And I don't think people should invest much more than maybe 5% or 10% of their investable assets in something like that.
Do you follow that formula yourself?
Yeah, absolutely.
Smart.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so let's assume you're starting over and you're ambitious. Like, what do you think are the best strategies for building wealth in a career, if it's not investing in venture companies?
I'm a bit old-fashioned. I don't believe in quick money. I believe that you kind of have to put in the hard labor, starting at the bottom, so to speak. And so I think developing good, I assume we're talking about business here, of start at the bottom, work your way up by earning it, and sort of build the right sort of skills before you kind of get into the riskier, make money quick kind of thing.
But ultimately, do you think building business is the best way to build wealth?
Oh yeah, I do. Yeah, I'm a free enterprise, small business oriented. I think it's the lifeblood of our country. It's the lifeblood of the U.S. economy, and we need more of it. In our country. And so, but it's tough. It's really tough. And a lot of people don't realize how tough it is. And I think it's important for people to really understand themselves, and are they willing to go through that pain of sort of starting a business, knowing that a high percentage of, small businesses fail. We all know that. And be prepared for, I guess, the heartache that comes along with some of the success, and it's tough.
How did you personally manage the heartache in your own business ventures?
Oh, I think I'm just naturally a risk taker. I guess my comments about earlier about growing up on a farm. I guess I'm a relatively independent person. I sort of have confidence. I think I've had confidence in myself, and I'm not afraid to take risks. I understand that failure will happen, and that you can pick yourself up from failure. And if you are that kind of person, then you should go for it.
How did you manage stress?
When I could, try to get out and exercise and try to take the weekends off. And in my career, it was easier to do because you didn't have things like cell phones didn't exist, and email wasn't as common, and kind of the instant communication that we have with something like text messaging today. It was easier to turn off the business. Early on in my career, there weren't even portable computers, so you couldn't even take your computer home. So it was easier to maybe get away from it, take the weekend, go to Whistler, go ski, and that kind of thing. And I think it's a real problem today, and I'm a bit of a technology addict myself, and it is very tough to turn off the cell phone and put it aside. And I think it's a real challenge to have a balance, in kind of between work and kind of how you manage your life.
I remember vividly in the entrepreneurship class that you spoke to when we were teenagers, you said, I think that the most solid business education you can get is in the chartered accountant program. And you also were really strong on computer science. And you were talking your book at that time. Do you still feel that's the best education to pursue today?
Well, I'm biased, so technology certainly has invaded every part of our life, right? your home runs off technology, your cars technology, airplanes technology, medicines technology. Technology is everywhere, and software. Again, my career was just totally fortuitous, as I've described, but software and related technologies are everywhere, and that will continue, into the future. So, and whether that's you become a graphic designer to design the interface on an automobile, or to design a website, or whether you're a musician because music's kind of part of it, technology will be pervasive in the future, even more pervasive as it is now. So certainly something related to technology I would certainly encourage.
Are there subsets of technology that you think are the most promising or exciting to be involved in these days?
Well, I'd say probably the most exciting, which has been around for a long time, but is now coming into prominence, is machine learning, sometimes referred to as artificial intelligence. We now have computing power and storage and data that we can actually use software to actually make decisions and to understand patterns in data, for example, that humans are not capable of. It's probably the most interesting area. It kind of leads into robotics, self-driving cars, many others. It's a hot topic. That's probably one of the most interesting areas.
Do you follow the quantum computing story?
Oh, yeah.
Could you explain it? Good luck.
Well, I was an early investor in a company called D-Wave, which
still waiting for your money back, right?
Just waiting for my money back, and wrote one of the first checks to D-Wave almost 20 years ago.
Wow.
Again, based on meeting a very interesting guy, Geordie Rose, who's still around town, who's got a new robotics company. Just sort of believed in the idea, and I guess at that point I was feeling a little flush and felt a little obligation to help somebody with a dream, which was a wacko idea that you would create a computer using sort of subatomic physics, and it would be able to do things faster than a conventional computer, and that's yet to be proven, but they've made progress, and there are people like NASA using the D-Wave computers, and several $100 million later in financing, they're still working at it.
Did you see the Google news last week about some breakthroughs potentially?
Well, there's a lot of different ways a lot of different technologies are called quantum computing, and yeah, there's a lot of competing technologies, but it's probably one of those things that we'll look back and say, yeah, it really did happen.
How do you choose mentees? Like, who is worth your time, and how does this relationship evolve from a mentor's perspective?
It usually always happens because someone knows me and they say, hey, would you have coffee with somebody? And it usually always happens through somebody I know, and they're trying to give advice to somebody and say, hey, I know some guy who knows about what I know about, which is software, and say how to build a company. And so it's usually somebody refers, and I'll always do it for a friend. And then what happens now, I've been around so long that often now it's some friend of mine who's my age, my vintage, says, hey, my son or my daughter. And so now I'm kind of meeting all of these, they're all the kids who are same age as my children.
Is that satisfying for you?
Yeah, I enjoy it.
Where do you think the best business ideas come from?
Usually from personal experience, meaning the person who comes up with the idea, they recognize something they could use, a product or a service, and they just have that aha moment that says, wow. And often it's quite a simple concept, and they just have an aha moment. And usually it's from some kind of personal experience. It's like, what's his name? Travis Kalanick, who, had the idea of, gee, I could, he had a limo service, and he just sort of had this kind of aha moment that, gee, you could just do a little app and people would go on the app and somebody could come and give them a ride because they were in the area, right? That was just a personal aha moment.
So from personal experience.
Yeah, using personal experience. That's where I see most of the ideas. I'm just recently invested in a company called Embrace, which is developing a new technology for a knee brace. And the entrepreneurs have knee injuries as athletes and kind of personal experience. And, one of them was a biomechanical engineer, and thought, gee, I could make a better brace than the one that I just paid $1,000 for. So, another example of kind of personal experience.
Do you believe in karma?
No.
No?
No.
But why are you so principled yourself?
I don't know. It's the way I was brought up, I guess.
What, for a closing question, Norm, what's your definition of a good man?
Someone who is, who deals with integrity and honesty and cares about their fellow human beings, I guess is what kind of, and that you leave the world just a little bit better than it was when you came into it, I guess. If you can help a small step forward with kind of society and, how the world is, I guess that's my definition of a good person.
It's amazing how much you can get out of giving back personally.
Yeah, it is.
Thank you so much, Norm, for years of friendship and for agreeing to do this today.
Hey, it's been fun.
Yeah,
Been
great
fun.
to see you.
Been fun.
Thanks.
Thanks.